If you've ever felt lost tracking down who accessed which data set in Microsoft 365, get ready. Fabric governance might look familiar, but there are some surprises you need to see. Is your M365 compliance experience enough to tame this new platform, or are there catches nobody told you about? Stick around. I'm going to show you exactly where Fabric borrows from M365 and where it changes the rules, sometimes when you least expect it. Why Fabric governance catches admins off guard. If you're coming from Microsoft 365, it's easy to assume Fabric will just slot in under your usual admin workflow. You launch the admin center and start poking around, expecting the settings menu to lead you where you need to go. That's where Fabric throws its first curveball. The environment looks close enough to feel comfortable, at least on the surface. The icons line up, the workspaces have familiar names, and you will see labels that remind you of Teams or SharePoint. But try moving through the standard setup and your muscle memory instantly trips over the differences. Permissions aren't hiding in their normal place, and when you do find them, the options read a little differently. That sense of "I've been here before" fades out as soon as you start looking for an old school bridge, like a straightforward inheritance pattern or a one-click audit configuration. Think about the admin who spent years fine-tuning access in SharePoint. They walk into Fabric with a certain confidence. Menus in Microsoft should follow a type of logic, right? The expectation is all those tricks for handling nested permissions, inheritance, even the group-based controls for managing access should translate. But Fabric breaks from that rhythm. You're looking for a way to adjust permissions on a library or a list, but Fabric wants you thinking about domains, workspaces, and specific items instead. Instead of a predictable stack of settings, you get overlapping pages, new terminology, and extra layers that don't quite line up with what you'd expect. Even the simple act of assigning a role comes with extra caveats about what admin, contributor, or member really means for a workspace versus a data item. That's where the friction starts. The marketing for Fabric sold it as an extension of what you already know, so you start by running your go-to playbook. You copy over your M365 permission structures, thinking that should cover us, and right away the cracks appear. Simple questions like, if I label this dataset as confidential, will it actually limit who can export or share it? Aren't answered where you'd expect. Suddenly, you're off to the documentation. And it isn't just you. We've all seen admins, seasoned ones, getting stumped by why their access controls don't stick or why their compliance monitor isn't catching everything. There's definitely a learning curve. The language is similar enough to lure you into old habits, but keywords have shifted. Menus overlap, so you're jumping between multiple screens trying to figure out which setting overrides the other. And some controls are split between the Fabric portal and the broader M365 admin center, or worse, they look joined but behave differently behind the scenes. You get this odd mashup, like deja vu, but with enough details out of place to slow you down at every step. It isn't just an annoyance for people who like things tidy. It means mistakes slip through the cracks. Auditing isn't as obvious. Permission inheritance doesn't always kick in. Meanwhile, you're getting pinged by the business when someone accidentally lets an unauthorized user peek at a sensitive data set. Speaking of that, here's the kind of scenario that happens more often than folks like to admit. A business analyst goes to share a dataset they've marked as internal. In M365, their previous experience taught them that sensitivity labels would cascade, restricting sharing outside the company. So they assume Fabric is doing the same thing in the background, except it's not. The permission surface works differently, so their internal-only data gets exposed to a partner by mistake, because the settings didn't propagate like they expected. Suddenly, you've got questions about who can see what, and the audit logs aren't showing what you thought they'd show. A big reason for all this, according to recent research from Microsoft's own Fabric documentation and early adopter surveys, is the introduction of data domains. In M365, most permissions revolve around the app or the container, like a SharePoint site or a Teams channel. With Fabric, the data domain model asks you to organize by logical business areas. It sounds simple enough, but it upends where you set controls and who's responsible for governance. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, Fabric spreads out ownership and makes you think carefully about the context in which data lives and moves. Many admins miss this shift at first, especially if they're used to painting with broad permission strokes rather than managing at a granular domain-specific level. So if you're finding yourself frustrated or even second-guessing that intuition built up from years in the M365 world, you're not alone. Fabric governance isn't just a facelift on top of your usual compliance tools. It's a new model. One that rewards those who take time to learn how data domains, workspace roles, and new audit points fit together. In the end, even M365 veterans need to plan for a different kind of map. But it's not like you're starting from scratch. While some of the landscape has changed, a core set of concepts still carry over. The trick now is figuring out what's familiar and how to translate that comfort level into these new rules. That's where things start to get interesting. Blueprints and mirrors, translating M365 compliance tools to Fabric. If you've ever wrestled with sensitivity labels in the M365 Compliance Center, you've probably noticed the promise: set a few policies, apply some labels, and you've got audit-ready confidence, right? So stepping into Fabric, it's perfectly natural to assume those same rules and shortcuts carry across. Let's see how that expectation holds up inside Fabric's walls. Sensitivity labels, DLP, data loss prevention policies, audit trails, those are staples of M365 governance. You might already have your go-to process for tagging a confidential file, knowing it'll follow users even if it leaves your tenant. Or maybe you've relied on audit dashboards to flag a suspicious download. It's a comfortable routine. In Fabric, you'll find these terms and tools, but if you're waiting for a one-to-one translation, you're in for a surprise. Start with sensitivity labels. In the M365 universe, these labels tend to behave like digital wrappers sticking to a document as it moves around the cloud or shows up in emails. The enforcement is predictable, but say you try to apply that same label in Fabric maybe to a Power BI dataset. It seems straightforward, but the propagation is where things start to split. In M365, label a document confidential and its access controls travel with it. Easy. In Fabric, you label your asset and suddenly you're asking, why isn't that restriction showing up for analytics users or when the data is copied elsewhere? It's because the label attaches at the object level but doesn't always enforce downstream, especially if the data is transformed or exported. That disconnect catches people off guard. DLP policies, another favorite tool you probably rely on in Exchange or SharePoint, work in Fabric but with important differences. In M365, DLP policies are the safety net: block an export, get an alert, maybe even run a forced encryption action. With Fabric, the framework exists, but coverage can feel inconsistent. Now, instead of one policy engine watching everything, you find DLP settings tucked inside the Fabric admin panels and sometimes in overlapping M365 areas. The tricky part is certain assets, say data warehouses or pipelines, don't always respect the same DLP triggers as a simple file stored in OneDrive. You need to read the fine print and test coverage, or you could end up with data slipping past your normal controls. Now, let's talk audit logs. Auditability is where seasoned admins either relax or tense up. In M365, the Compliance Center is your reconnaissance base. Everything shows up in the unified audit log, from file opens in SharePoint to message edits in Teams. You search, filter, export, no drama. Fabric offers audit logging too, but you'll quickly notice these logs sometimes live in their own corners. Some actions get piped into the M365 Center, but others only exist in Fabric's own dashboards. For example, certain analytics, queries, report views, or pipeline runs in Fabric create audit events you won't see in your classic compliance searches. If you're investigating a breach or simply validating compliance, knowing where to look and what's missing really matters. Here's a tangible scenario. You apply a sensitivity label to a Power BI dataset inside Fabric, just like you would for a confidential document in SharePoint. The expectation is that anyone trying to share, export, or copy that data will hit a permission wall. In reality, while the dataset might show its label, actual restrictions can be hit or miss. A report built on that data might not inherit the label, or external connections could bypass those settings if you're not diligent. This patchwork effect means your risk of accidental exposure goes up unless you double-check every layer. With audit logs, the differences might make you nostalgic for a good old unified audit. Suppose you're asked to trace who changed a data flow last Thursday. M365 would offer a robust filter and export tool. Fabric does have that search function, but quirky labeling and the placement of logs can slow you down. Sometimes digging up that information means jumping between Fabric logs and M365 logs, with gaps appearing if the action isn't recognized by both systems. It's not always intuitive, and those gaps are where compliance headaches start. Microsoft's approach wasn't to copy-paste M365's toolkit into Fabric. According to Fabric documentation and blogs from early adopters, governance here is designed to echo M365 patterns, but relies on data mesh concepts layered on top. That means Fabric emphasizes decentralized data ownership, context-driven access, and object-centric controls more than the container-based approach you're used to. The idea is that each domain, like finance, HR, or sales, can set its own rules, and those rules integrate with, but don't necessarily depend on, central M365 settings. It's modular, but also means you need to develop new habits. So where does your M365 experience actually help? If you understand sensitivity labels, you know why marking assets matters. If you've run audit searches, you already know what evidence stakeholders will ask for. But the trick is watching for the almost but not quite moments. Fabric's terminology is familiar, but the execution changes around context and granularity. Leverage your M365 toolkit, but take time for a Fabric walkthrough before you trust your instincts. The bottom line is this. If you've locked down your SharePoint or finessed DLP in Exchange, you're off to a solid start. Just be ready for a few sharp turns. Some routines carry across, others just look familiar until you try them in practice. These familiar tools give you a running start, but the real test is adapting your approach for Fabric's quirks. And that becomes even more obvious when you take a closer look at access, which bends the rules in its own ways. Access control, where Fabric borrows and breaks from SharePoint and Teams. If you've set up access controls in SharePoint or Teams, you know how the system works. The comfort comes from years of patterns. Give a group access at the top, and permissions drip down through everything underneath. Inheritance makes life predictable. Even with Teams, you adjust the Teams membership, and everyone slots right into the permissions you expect, more or less. But Fabric mixes things up. It gives you just enough of that familiar structure to make you comfortable, then flips the details around. Suddenly, you're not dealing with just site collections and groups. You're dealing with workspaces, objects, and here's the part that usually gets missed, data domains, all with their own set of switches. The first place you notice things veering off course is with inheritance. You might assign someone to a workspace thinking they're good, they have access to everything in here. In SharePoint, that works. In Fabric, you find out there are layers underneath. Items inside that workspace, like datasets or reports, might have their own explicit permissions. That means even if a user has workspace access, they can still get blocked at the object level, and vice versa. It's like granting access to a library only for someone to get stopped at a special archive room inside. This isn't just a philosophical difference, it's practical. An admin could assign someone as a workspace member, expecting them to see every dataset and item. The reality? Without object-level permissions on specific datasets, users run into a wall. Then come the tickets, I can't see the data I need, and everything bogs down. Here's a situation I've seen more than once. You get an urgent request from a department. They've onboarded a new analyst and need them to access sales dashboards. So you add them at the workspace level for the sales domain. When the analyst goes to open a core dataset, though, they can't. The dataset has been locked down at the item level, maybe because an earlier admin decided it was extra sensitive. In Teams or SharePoint, admins expect to trace inheritance and fix it in one shot. In Fabric, you're left spelunking through nested permissions, trying to piece together why membership up top doesn't always mean access everywhere below. And then you factor in domains. This isn't just a new word. Fabric's data domains are a real twist. Instead of just creating folders or libraries, you're tasked with organizing resources in ways that reflect how your business units actually run. Domains bring a new flavor to access control, centered on real-world organizational boundaries. A user might belong to multiple domains. Their access shifts depending on where they're working. It's powerful, but for admins coming from the old world of blanket access, it's extra complexity. Microsoft makes it clear in their documentation. Don't assume your M365 permission models will transfer. Data mesh governance in Fabric must be designed for each domain. That means governance by context, not template. Let's not forget roles. The labels sound familiar: admin, member, contributor, but the impact isn't always one-to-one with what you've seen in Teams or SharePoint. One workspace might treat members as pure editors, while another might have layered restrictions where members still get blocked on high-value datasets. Contributors often discover they can load objects but can't always publish or see all datasets depending on how granular things are set. Without careful planning, users can wind up with either too much power or stuck on the outside looking in, even though they're in the group. And if you think audit logs will save you, remember, in Fabric, tracking permission changes and access history can feel less unified than what you get with the M365 compliance dashboard. Now, let's talk about the reality of all these controls mashed together. On one hand, it's flexible. If you want fine-grained access down to the file or dataset, you can do it. But it's also easy to over-permission, especially when you're juggling workspaces, roles, and domain rules. Accidental exposure creeps in through little gaps. A user added in a hurry, or a data set that slipped through because you missed the object level override. Even the best admins can forget to check those corners, especially when their brain's still wired for the M365 group model. Instead of a single source of truth, you're working with an overlapping set of permissions, any one of which can open a door you thought was locked. Microsoft's best practices make it blunt. Assuming old models will just click into place is what gets most teams into trouble. Data mesh governance isn't just marketing jargon. It forces you to put access rules where they belong, at the domain, workspace, and object. That means more power to tune controls for each use case, but a bigger cognitive load too. The result, unless you get hands-on and actively track how roles interact with domains, you risk missing out on critical audit signals. If a permission slips, it may not be flagged in your usual compliance tools, and that's when issues turn into actual breaches. The encouraging part is that your background in M365 group-based access still matters. The instincts around least privilege or careful delegation give you a foundation to work from, but that approach only gets you as far as Fabric's own multi-layered permissions allow. You pick up the rest by diving into the specifics of how Fabric structures access, by mixing workspace roles, object overrides, and domain context. That's just one side of governance. Setting access controls well is critical, but compliance and auditing feel different as soon as you cross into Fabric's reporting and oversight tools. That shift brings its own unique surprises. Audit, lineage, and compliance, the hidden differences that trip up pros. If you've spent time in the M365 Compliance Center, you probably feel at home picking through audit logs and tracking data lineage. It's familiar territory. Open up a dashboard, punch in a few filters, and watch the story unfold. Who touched what, when it happened, and where files traveled. With Fabric, though, those instincts don't get you as far as you'd expect. The tools might echo what you know from M365, but the details force you to work a little harder, and the price of missing something is higher. Most admins don't see the catch until the first time there's a real incident. Let's say you catch wind that a sensitive report, maybe quarterly financials, was shared externally. In the classic M365 world, you'd hit the compliance center, run an audit search, and usually come away with a clear sequence of events. In Fabric, you might start in the same place, but you soon realize you're working with a blend of audit endpoints. Some activities log inside M365, while others live exclusively in Fabric's own audit pane. Tracking the flow of a report through different workspaces, then figuring out where lineage diverges from the audit trail creates a scavenger hunt. It's not just a new UI to learn, it's a new process that asks you to jump between tools. And here's the kicker, sometimes key evidence lives only in one system or the other. Picture what happens to a compliance officer who needs to reconstruct the journey of a sensitive data set. They're used to a unified dashboard, so at first they don't notice that Fabric's objects bring their own breed of lineage tracking, one that doesn't always tie back to the broader M365 audit logs. They get halfway through the investigation only to discover there are gaps. Certain transformations, data flows, or even Power BI report exports log actions in Fabric but never surface in M365. The officer chases leads, clicks through every available drill down, and ends up with a screenshot mosaic instead of an integrated report. The good news? Fabric actually raises the bar for data lineage visuals. Once you get past the vocabulary, terms like artifact, upstream, and downstream flows, you realize you can follow data through every touchpoint. Instead of simply seeing that a file changed hands, you get to graph the step-by-step transformation of a dataset from source, through ETL jobs to the dashboards that surface insights. That's more granularity than what most M365 admins are used to, but it comes at the cost of needing to decode new visualizations, and the path is less about following a breadcrumb trail and more about mapping a subway system. If you've ever stared at a Fabric lineage diagram for the first time, you know the feeling. The scope is impressive, but you have to retrain your eye to spot where access splintered or where sensitive data took a sidetrack. Integration with the M365 Compliance Center helps, but it doesn't fill every hole. You'll find that certain Fabric compliance events, say dataset sharing, pipeline runs, or workspace role changes, make it into M365 audit feeds, while others, including lineage changes and object level access adjustments, only live inside Fabric's portal. It's easy to assume if it's important, it must show up everywhere. But that assumption trips up a lot of skilled people. Early adopters keep running into cases where the audit logs in M365 look clean, but Fabric's native tools reveal missed events. Microsoft calls it a hybrid model, which sounds neat until you're scrambling for answers and realize you checked one dashboard, not both. Best practices here aren't obvious. Most admins start by mirroring their old compliance routines, only to realize that Fabric's controls need dedicated setup. If you want solid oversight, you have to activate detailed audit logging inside Fabric itself, configure retention policies, and actually review those logs on Fabric's terms. Just setting it and forgetting it in M365 won't protect you from hidden exposures. It's worth running real investigations as tests. Try following a report's full journey, from the first ingestion in a data flow, through transformations, and all the way to the published dashboard. Watch for steps that silently break the audit trail and document which logs live, where that map will save you during real incidents. Another tip, get familiar with Fabric's terminology and mapping features early on. Data lineage diagrams are useful, but their power comes only if you know how to connect what you see with questions you're being asked about data sharing, regulatory compliance, or even simple troubleshooting. Don't be shy about creating reference guides for your team or setting up shortcuts to commonly checked audit points. The more ground you cover ahead of time, the better you limit your exposure to missed signals. Here's the real takeaway. M365 compliance comfort isn't a risk on its own, but over-relying on it can give you a false sense of security in Fabric. The stakes are bigger, not because the tools are worse, but because unfamiliar layers make easy things easy to miss. Staying both thorough and flexible is how the best admins avoid getting blindsided. Now that we've flagged these hidden differences, it's worth asking, what does all this actually mean for admins looking to make the most out of Fabric's governance beyond just staying out of trouble? If you've been treating Fabric like it's just M365 with new branding, the cracks show fast. The controls shift, the language changes, and your familiar playbooks need tweaking. It's not about abandoning what you know, it's about pushing your comfort zone and looking for the detail hiding behind familiar menus. The admins who adapt, who stay curious about each domain and audit nuance are the ones shaping standards in this space. Don't coast on past habits. Question everything, share your discoveries, and keep engaging. There's always a next quirk, a smarter workaround, or a sharper question right around the corner.